it's very difficult to find out what's going on in terms of technology development, and people kept asking me, are there novel drugs being developed in China? Well, yeah, sure, I saw a couple in Beijing, and I saw 3 or 4 in Shanghai, and so on, but I couldn't really put my arms around it. So we decided to do our own research, and we went through the patents starting in the year 2000. And I'll make an apology here. I said I was up till 1:30 getting all the stats and everything from our team in Shanghai. This is one we didn't get updated. So this data is as of June of this year. This isn't updated as of the end of the year yet. But at least the data through 2006 should be complete at this point. We have the same patent publishing delay as we do in the US and China. So what we found that over this period of time, basically over a 10-year period of time, we have about 1,100 novel molecules patented in China as small molecules, and about 1,000 biologics, and about 261 novel targets. Now, what we can't tell you universally across the board here, whether all these are novel on a global basis, but we were looking in the China space. So, for example, in some of our engagements with clients, we've gone through this further and then figured out if there was global IP associated with these assets, and often there is. So, but there are a lot of, just to characterize things, there are a lot of what people call junk patents in China, because the government really wants everyone to do patents, and so sometimes they just file a patent to get a piece of paper, and the patent system in China is still moving forward in terms of sophistication. So generally, if you hire a Chinese law firm that used to be a government law firm, then they're basically kind of paper stampers, versus if you use more credible firms like either a Western firm that's working with, like Morrison Foerster, that's working with a Chinese firm in collaboration with a Chinese firm, you're much more likely to get a high quality patent that way. So anyway, it's jumped up tenfold over the period that we looked at, and 44% over the last 1 year period that we had full data for it. So patents by location. This was actually a little surprising to me, because I've visited a number of institutes all over China, but in particular in Beijing and Shanghai. And Beijing has the National Institute of Biological Sciences, which is sort of like the Hughes Institute of Medicine in terms of research. And I was surprised that patents were lower. But then also I can relate to when I went to Beijing and I visited the DIBS Institute, that I went in and they had this wall of over 200 papers they published. I said, wow, so what's your patent portfolio like? He said, oh, we just published, we didn't patent. So all of that went into the public domain, but they now have a patent, they've now using a patent attorney, and so hopefully they'll be patenting things going forward. Shanghai is much more commercialization oriented, so a much higher percentage of patents. Another thing that's somewhat surprising here, I guess two things. One is that the number of large molecule patents, I think, is a larger proportion than we would have expected, basically half of the patents. And the other thing that was a little surprising is once you hit the top 3 or 4 areas here, the number falls off precipitously, but basically more than a third of the patents on novel molecules in China come from all over the place. So if you're looking for high value assets, you can't just go to Shanghai and Beijing, although it's a good place to start. You have to kind of go all over China, or you're going to miss some interesting things. This is kind of what I was saying earlier. If you look at the patents and where they go, oncology, infectious disease, cardiovascular disease are number 1, 2, 3. And then, as you might expect, immunology and metabolic disease. CNS is actually kind of an up-and-coming area, particularly if you look at what's going on in preclinical activity. CNS, I think, is the number 3 area. And by the way, China didn't recognize CNS as a disease until fairly recently. I think it's like 6 or 7 years ago or so. Clinical trial activity. Well, I'd like to say we went to clinicaltrials.gov.cn and we looked up all this data. Well, there is no such thing. So we had to basically go out, do all the research, secondary research through all the news, and then do primary research and calling all the research folks that we knew and find out what was going on. So this is basically 6-year data, taking a 6-year snapshot. We went back to 2004 to find out everything that had been going on. So in that time period, that 6-year period, there's been 148 new drugs that went into SFDA trials. And that's all we're talking about here, are just trials within China. So during that time, 110 new drugs entered the clinic, 26 new drugs were launched, of which 9 were novel molecules, which is a pretty good percentage. So when I say new drugs, these are class 1 drugs. So that means that they're new to China, but not necessarily novel molecules. But they're not generics either. It's a little hard to explain, but if you want to sit down, I'll try and explain it a little better than I just did. 7 new drugs were entered and launched in China during that time frame. So one of the questions we often get is, well, we hear it takes forever to get things through the SFDA. That's actually not quite true. It takes forever to get things into the SFDA, but once you do that, things move quickly. But there were 7 drugs in this time period that entered and came out in the 6-year period. I think in the 5-year period from the year before, there were 5 that came through. 122 new drugs currently in the clinic and 187 in preclinical development. The only thing I can really say about the 187 number is it's low, because if you think it's hard to find clinical information, try and find preclinical information in China. It's very, very difficult to find that. So just in the year 2009, we had 12 new drugs that entered the clinic, and 3 new drugs were approved, which China calls launched, if you will. That means they were approved to go on the market, not just phase 3 approved. If we look at clinical trials, you might recognize the order here. It's basically the same as the patents. We got oncology, infectious disease, and cardiovascular and cardiocerebral were categorized together here. And then again, same thing, endocrine, metabolic, CNS. I think these two maybe switched a little bit, but we're talking very small differences in the percentage or the number. So. Drug type, this is somewhat interesting. Small molecules, actually this percentage has been increasing over the time we've been tracking this data, which is a little bit surprising. I would expect biologics to be increasing, but generally the trend, for whatever reason, is a little bit more toward the small molecule than the biologics. Vaccines are very strong in China. Gene therapy, as you probably know, China approved the first gene therapy drug in the world, the first drug to be approved. They used to say a lot about that. They don't really say a whole lot about it anymore because it doesn't work, apparently. The good news is it doesn't hurt anyone. But clinical trial status, this is just a snapshot of where the clinical trials are right now. So if we took a snapshot, a week from now, it might look a little bit different. But this is as of the end of the year. So there are 122 new drugs in the clinic, as I mentioned earlier. In terms of trends, the interesting thing that we saw on this versus data from last year is there's more drugs in phase 3 on a percentage basis. And I went back and I looked and I said, okay, so are we just sort of, things are moving along and we're not getting as much in? No, it's up all the way across. It just, apparently things are now moving through better than they were. As you probably know, the head of the SFDA was executed in 2007. And for some reason, no one else wanted to take his place for a while. So things kind of slowed down in the SFDA until they kind of got reorganized. So preclinical, I have no explanation for this, but for 4 years that we've looked at the data, once it kind of ramped up to about 40 new preclinical, these are 40 new molecules going into preclinical studies. It's kind of held 40 new molecules every year.